Welcome to Chosen by Love, where fate brings hearts together in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe and join our growing family of story lovers. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's begin today's journey. The most life-changing promises are sometimes whispered in the middle of your worst heartbreak. The first violin stopped before the final note, and in the silence that followed, every guest inside the historic Charleston Chapel seemed to forget how to breathe. Maren Calloway stood beneath an arch of white roses she had designed with her own hands, her wedding dress catching the soft afternoon light pouring through stained glass windows. Just 15 minutes earlier, the room had been alive with laughter, cameras flashing, and relatives wiping away joyful tears. Now hundreds of uneasy glances shifted from one face to another as whispers spread through the pews faster than wildfire. The groom wasn't late anymore. He simply wasn't coming. Maren looked toward the heavy wooden doors one more time, hoping they would swing open and erase the nightmare unfolding before her eyes. They never moved. Instead, her maid of honor hurried toward her, clutching a trembling cell phone. Her face had turned pale. She didn't need to say a word. Maren already knew. The message on the screen was painfully short. "I'm sorry. I can't do this." That was it. No explanation. No apology worthy of the years they had shared together. No courage to face the woman waiting at the altar. Just one sentence that shattered an entire future. Around the chapel, conversations began in hushed voices. Some guests looked sympathetic. Others looked embarrassed. A few quietly reached for their coats, uncertain whether to leave or pretend nothing had happened. Maren could feel every pair of eyes on her. She wanted to disappear. Her father lowered his head, trying to hide the heartbreak on his face. Her mother forced herself to remain standing, though tears had already begun rolling silently down her cheeks. Even the wedding coordinator froze, unsure whether to stop the music or keep pretending this ceremony still had a chance. Maren swallowed hard, determined not to cry. She had promised herself years ago that no matter how painful life became, she would never allow humiliation to steal her dignity. She lifted her chin, but her hands trembled against the bouquet she had arranged before sunrise. Every flower reminded her of the hours she had spent believing today would be the happiest day of her life. Instead, it had become the day she would never forget for entirely different reasons. Then something unexpected happened. From the very last row of the chapel, a tall man slowly stood. He wasn't family. He wasn't part of the bridal party. Most guests barely noticed him until he began walking calmly down the center aisle. His charcoal suit fit perfectly, but nothing about him demanded attention more than his quiet confidence. While everyone else whispered, he remained completely composed. His blue eyes never left Maren. She searched her memory, trying to place his face, but nothing came. He was a stranger. The man stopped only a few feet away. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The chapel seemed frozen in time. Even the photographer lowered his camera. Then the stranger stepped closer, careful not to invade her space, and spoke so softly that only she could hear. "Pretend to marry me instead." Maren blinked, convinced she had imagined the words. Her heart pounded louder than the silence surrounding them. "What?" she whispered, barely finding her voice. The stranger didn't smile. He didn't look amused or reckless. His expression remained calm, almost reassuring, as though he had carefully considered every word before saying it. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "My name is Alistair Vaughn. I know exactly how impossible this sounds, but if you trust me for the next 10 minutes, I can save you from walking out of this chapel alone." Maren stared into his eyes, searching for any sign that this was some cruel joke. She found none. Behind him, curious guests leaned forward, unable to hear the conversation but sensing something extraordinary was unfolding. The minister waited silently at the altar. The orchestra remained motionless. Time itself seemed suspended between heartbreak and possibility. Maren tightened her grip around the bouquet as 1,000 questions raced through her mind. She had never seen this man before. She had no reason to believe him. And yet something about the certainty in his voice made the impossible feel strangely real. Before she could answer, Alistair leaned in one final time and whispered words that would change both of their lives forever. "Just trust me. I'll explain everything afterward." Maren searched Alistair's face for even the smallest hint of hesitation, but she found only quiet certainty. Around them, the chapel remained suspended in uncomfortable silence as every second stretched longer than the last. She finally managed to whisper, "Why would you do this for someone you have never met?" Alistair glanced briefly toward the guests before returning his attention to her. "Because I know what public humiliation can do to a person, and because this solution helps both of us." His answer only deepened her confusion. "I do not understand." He nodded once as if he had expected that response. "You should not. Not yet. But I promise you this is not charity, and it is not pity. I need a wife today almost as much as you need to avoid walking out of this chapel alone." Maren felt her pulse racing. None of this made sense. She had arrived expecting to begin a marriage with the man she thought she loved. Now a complete stranger was calmly asking her to marry him instead. It sounded impossible, reckless, almost unbelievable. Yet there was something strangely respectful about the way he spoke. He was not pressuring her. He was giving her a choice. Alistair lowered his voice even further. "There are business reasons I cannot explain here. If I leave this chapel unmarried today, my family's charitable trust automatically transfers voting control to distant relatives under a clause written by my grandfather decades ago. That trust funds hospitals, scholarships, and thousands of employees through the Vaughan Foundation. I cannot allow that legacy to fall into the wrong hands. I was prepared to solve the problem another way. But when I saw what happened to you, I realized there might be a solution that protects both of us." Maren frowned. "You are asking me to marry someone I met less than 1 minute ago. I am asking you to pretend that today happened differently than either of us expected," he answered. "Nothing more." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She looked toward her parents. Her father stood motionless, trying to appear strong even as disappointment weighed heavily across his face. Her mother forced a hopeful smile, but the sadness in her eyes could not be hidden. Maren knew exactly what tomorrow's headlines would say. The abandoned bride. The wedding that never happened. Years of whispers would follow her wherever she went. She closed her eyes for one brief moment. Every instinct told her to run. Every ounce of pride begged her to leave the chapel and never look back. Yet another quiet voice inside her reminded her that the future she had imagined had already disappeared the moment that text message arrived. Alistair reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple leather card holder. He opened it just enough for her to read the name engraved beneath a polished silver logo. Alistair Vaughan, Chief Executive Officer, Vaughan Global Holdings. The name struck her immediately. Even someone who avoided business news recognized it. The company owned hotels, technology firms, and charitable foundations across the country. She looked back at him in disbelief. "You are that Alistair Vaughan?" He gave a small nod. "Yes. But today I would rather simply be the man standing beside you." Before she could answer, the wedding coordinator cautiously approached. "Miss Calloway," she whispered gently, "the guests are asking whether the ceremony has been cancelled." Maren looked from the coordinator to her parents and then back to Alistair. "If I agree," she asked carefully, "what happens after today?" "After today," he replied, "we talk honestly. We establish boundaries. If you decide you cannot continue, I will make certain you leave with your dignity intact and without financial consequences. But for the next few minutes, I am asking you to trust someone who has absolutely no intention of breaking that trust." The bouquet trembled slightly in her hands. The white roses she had arranged before dawn suddenly felt heavier than ever. She took one slow breath, then another. Finally, she lifted her chin and looked directly into Alistair's eyes. "If this is truly a choice," she said softly, "then my answer is yes." For the first time since he had stepped into the aisle, the smallest genuine smile appeared on Alistair's face. He turned toward the waiting minister and quietly said, "Please give us 5 minutes. There are a few promises we need to make before we stand at that altar together." Maren followed Alistair into a quiet bridal preparation room just off the chapel hallway, closing the door behind them as the distant murmur of confused guests faded into the background. For the first time that afternoon, she was able to breathe without feeling every eye in the room watching her. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds before Alistair carefully removed a folded document from a slim leather portfolio. He placed it on the small dressing table but made no attempt to push it toward her. "This is not a trap," he said calmly. "It is simply a written agreement so there are never misunderstandings between us." Marin looked down at the pages without touching them. "You planned this?" she asked. Alistair slowly shook his head. "No. These documents were prepared for a completely different emergency. Because of the trust clause, my legal team prepared several contingency documents months ago in case an emergency marriage arrangement ever became necessary. I never expected to use them, and certainly not like this. I never imagined I would meet you today." She studied his face again. Everything about him remained remarkably composed, yet there was something hidden beneath that calm expression. He looked like a man carrying responsibilities far heavier than he wanted anyone else to see. Marin finally opened the document. The language was surprisingly simple. There were no impossible legal phrases, no complicated financial conditions. Instead, the first page listed only 3 commitments. They would present themselves publicly as husband and wife. They would respect each other's independence and personal decisions. 1 year from today, either person could choose to end the marriage. Without argument or obligation. She looked up. "That is all." "That is enough," Alistair replied. "Trust cannot exist if there are too many rules." Marin slowly continued reading until she reached the final page. There was no demand that she change who she was. No expectation that she abandon her family or career. In fact, one paragraph specifically guaranteed that she could continue running her small floral studio exactly as before. "You already knew I owned a flower business?" she asked quietly. "I asked my assistant to verify only the basic facts before I approached you. I needed to know you were a real person and not someone seeking attention." She almost laughed despite everything that had happened. "And what did you discover?" A faint smile appeared. "That you built your business from a garage behind your parents' house, that you employ 4 people, and that every wedding you design receives extraordinary reviews." Marin felt a warmth she had not expected. He had not investigated her bank account or her social status. He had noticed the work she loved. She placed the agreement back onto the table. "I have one condition." Alistair nodded immediately. "Tell me. Do not ever lie to me. If this marriage begins with honesty, maybe we can both survive it with our dignity." He extended his hand without hesitation. "Agreed." She accepted the handshake. His grip was firm but gentle, lasting only long enough to seal the promise. Then Alistair reached into another pocket and removed 2 simple platinum wedding bands resting inside a small velvet box. They were elegant without being extravagant. He held one in his palm before quietly saying, "These rings represent the only promise I expect us to keep today. Respect. Nothing else is owed until it is earned." Marin carefully picked up the smaller ring. It felt surprisingly warm against her fingertips, as though it already carried the weight of a future neither of them could predict. "And after 1 year?" she asked. Alistair looked at the ring in his own hand before answering. "If we both decide to walk away, you will return this to me, and we will thank each other for helping through a difficult chapter of life." He paused for a brief moment before adding softly, "But until then, I will do everything in my power to make certain you never regret saying yes today." A gentle knock interrupted the conversation. The wedding coordinator opened the door only a few inches. "Everyone is ready," she whispered. "Whenever you are." Marin looked down at the bouquet she had almost dropped only minutes earlier. She adjusted one white rose that had slipped slightly out of place and drew one slow breath. Then she slipped the platinum ring into her hand, lifted her chin, and walked beside Alistair toward the chapel doors, unaware that the first step into their carefully planned arrangement had already begun changing both of their hearts. Marin barely remembered the ceremony itself. The minister spoke the familiar words. Guests slowly rose from their seats, and one by one the expressions of confusion transformed into cautious smiles. Moments earlier they had expected to witness the most heartbreaking ending imaginable. Instead, they applauded as though they had simply watched an unusual delay before a beautiful beginning. When Alistair gently slipped the platinum ring onto her finger, his movements were steady and respectful. He did not rush. He did not pretend affection that did not exist. He simply looked into her eyes and quietly said, "Thank you." Somehow those two words carried more sincerity than every promise she had heard earlier that day. After signing the marriage license, photographers eagerly gathered outside the chapel. Reporters had already begun arriving, alerted by rumors that something extraordinary had happened. Alistair instinctively stepped beside Maren rather than in front of her, allowing her to decide whether she wished to answer questions. She appreciated that more than he probably realized. When one reporter shouted, "Mrs. Vaughn, did you know this was going to happen?" Maren hesitated for only a second before answering honestly, "No. Life surprised both of us today." Another reporter asked whether it had been love at first sight. Alistair calmly smiled without making the story more dramatic than it was. "Sometimes respect arrives before love," he answered. "Today is simply the beginning of a conversation." Those words spread across social media within minutes. Within an hour, every major news outlet and television network was covering the extraordinary wedding. Some people called it the most romantic wedding rescue they had ever seen. Others insisted the entire ceremony had been carefully staged. Television commentators debated every detail before the newlyweds had even left Charleston. By sunset, every major business publication was discussing the unexpected marriage of Billionaire Chief Executive Officer Alistair Vaughn. Most articles focused on the mystery. Some questioned the timing. Others admired the dignity with which both of them had handled an impossible situation. Only a handful knew how fragile the truth actually was. As evening settled over Charleston, a black luxury sedan quietly carried them away from the chapel. The city lights reflected across the windows while neither of them spoke for several minutes. Maren finally broke the silence. "Everything happened so fast that I still feel like I am watching someone else's life." Alistair nodded thoughtfully. "I imagine you are exhausted." She laughed softly for the first time that day. "That is one way to describe it." He reached into the small refrigerator built into the center console and handed her a bottle of sparkling water. "You barely ate anything all afternoon." She accepted it with a grateful smile. "How did you notice that?" "I notice details," he replied simply. "It is part of leading a company." She took a sip before looking out the window again. "Does everyone around you live according to schedules and plans?" "Usually." "Then today must have been difficult for you too." He remained quiet long enough that she wondered whether he would answer at all. Finally he said, "Nothing about today followed my plans." The honesty in his voice surprised her. Nearly 40 minutes later the car passed through elegant wrought iron gates and traveled along a tree-lined driveway illuminated by warm lanterns. Maren stared through the glass as an impressive stone estate appeared ahead. It looked less like a mansion and more like a timeless country residence surrounded by carefully designed gardens. She expected dozens of employees waiting at the entrance. Instead, only one older gentleman opened the front door with a welcoming smile. "Welcome home, Mr. Vaughn," he said warmly before turning toward her. "And welcome, Mrs. Vaughn." The title sounded unfamiliar, almost borrowed from someone else's life. Alistair introduced him as Theodore, the estate manager who had worked with his family for more than 30 years. Theodore treated Maren with genuine kindness rather than curiosity, immediately offering to show her the guest wing until she felt comfortable. As they stepped inside, Maren expected polished marble, expensive artwork, and rooms designed only to impress visitors. Those things certainly existed, yet what caught her attention first was something much simpler. A half-finished jigsaw puzzle rested on a library table. An old acoustic guitar leaned against a fireplace. Several cookbooks lay open in the kitchen beside handwritten recipe cards. The house felt lived in instead of displayed. She turned toward Alistair with quiet surprise. "I thought billionaires hired chefs every night." He loosened his tie with an almost embarrassed smile. "Sometimes. But I usually cook for myself when I can. It reminds me that ordinary routines matter more than extraordinary headlines." For the first time since that impossible afternoon began, Maren realized the man she had married was nothing like the image the world had created around him, and she quietly wondered what other truths were waiting behind the carefully guarded walls he had spent years building around his heart. The next morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the estate, casting long golden beams across polished hardwood floors. Maren woke earlier than anyone expected, still adjusting to the unfamiliar silence that surrounded the enormous house. She quietly made her way downstairs, following the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. To her surprise, she found Alistair already standing in the kitchen wearing a simple navy sweater instead of an expensive suit. A skillet rested on the stove while slices of sourdough bread toasted nearby. He looked up as she entered and offered a small smile. "Good morning. I hope you do not mind breakfast being simple." Maren blinked in surprise. "You really were not joking about cooking?" He shrugged lightly. "It clears my head before difficult days." She noticed a handwritten recipe card resting beside the cutting board, its edges worn from years of use. "Family recipe?" she asked. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "My mother taught me before she passed away. I still make it the same way." There was no dramatic pause, no attempt to gain sympathy. He simply stated the fact and continued stirring scrambled eggs. Maren suddenly understood why the house felt so personal. It was not filled with luxury for the sake of appearances. It was filled with memories. Breakfast was surprisingly comfortable. They spoke about ordinary things rather than contracts or business. Maren described the flower shop she had built from the ground up, explaining how every bouquet told a different story depending on the couple. Alistair listened carefully instead of checking his phone. When she described waking before sunrise to prepare fresh arrangements for weddings, he smiled. "That explains why every review says your flowers make people feel something." She laughed softly. "Most people notice the flowers for about 5 minutes. I noticed them immediately," he replied. "The roses in the chapel were extraordinary." She looked down, slightly embarrassed. "Thank you." Before the conversation could continue, Theodore entered carrying a leather portfolio and an electronic tablet. "Sir, your vehicle will be ready in 30 minutes. The Ashford Foundation Gala begins at 7 this evening. The board members have confirmed attendance." Alistair sighed quietly before looking toward Maren. "I realize this is sooner than either of us expected, but I need to ask another favor." She tilted her head. "Another one? Tonight will be our first public appearance as husband and wife. Nearly every major investor, executive, and board member will be there." Maren smiled nervously. "No pressure." He almost laughed. "I wish I could honestly say that." After Theodore left the room, Alistair became noticeably more serious. "There is someone you should know about before tonight. His name is Victor Langley. He has served on the board for years, but he enjoys testing people, especially anyone he believes does not belong." Maren folded her hands around her coffee mug. "You think he will test me?" "I know he will." "Does he know about our agreement?" "No. But he will assume you married me for wealth. He tends to judge people before learning who they really are." Maren remained quiet for several moments before asking, "And what do you usually do when he behaves that way?" Alistair looked toward the garden outside the kitchen window. "Normally I ignore him." She nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that is why he keeps doing it." He turned back toward her, surprised by the observation. She continued gently. "Flowers survive storms because they bend without breaking. People are not so different. Sometimes respect has to be shown, not demanded." Alistair studied her with genuine curiosity. She had entered his life less than 24 hours earlier, yet she spoke with a quiet confidence completely untouched by his wealth or reputation. For the first time in years, someone challenged his habits without trying to impress him. Later that afternoon, garment bags arrived from a well-known designer, along with jewelry carefully selected for the evening gala. Maren thanked the stylist but politely chose only a classic emerald green gown, and the simple platinum wedding ring already resting on her finger. She left the expensive diamonds untouched inside their velvet box. When Alistair noticed her decision before they departed, he asked why. She smiled gently and lifted her left hand. "I already have the only piece of jewelry this evening actually requires." He looked at the modest platinum band for a long moment before opening the limousine door for her, silently realizing that the woman sitting beside him measured value very differently from nearly everyone else in his world. The Ashford Foundation Gala filled the grand ballroom with soft music, crystal chandeliers, and conversations that carried the polished confidence of people accustomed to influence. Maren stepped through the entrance beside Alistair, her emerald green gown flowing gently as cameras flashed from every direction. She felt dozens of curious eyes following her, measuring everything from her smile to the simple platinum band resting on her left hand. Alistair quietly noticed the tension in her shoulders. Without saying a word, he slowed his pace just enough for her to walk comfortably beside him instead of struggling to match the rhythm of experienced executives. It was a small gesture, but Marin appreciated it more than he realized. Throughout the reception, guests introduced themselves with carefully rehearsed compliments, yet many of them seemed more interested in discovering how an unknown florist had suddenly become Mrs. Vaughn. Marin answered every question with calm honesty, never exaggerating her past, and never pretending to belong to a world she had entered only yesterday. Her sincerity caught several people by surprise. Across the ballroom, Victor Langley observed the conversations with growing skepticism. He was a distinguished man in his 60s whose reputation for challenging everyone had become legendary inside Vaughn Global Holdings. Carrying a glass of sparkling water, he approached the couple with an expression that looked friendly enough to everyone else but immediately signaled caution to Alistair. "Congratulations," Victor said smoothly. "Although I must admit the timing of your marriage surprised many of us." Alistair remained composed. Life occasionally moves faster than board meetings. A few nearby executives laughed politely. Victor shifted his attention toward Marin. "Tell me, Mrs. Vaughn, have you always dreamed of attending events like this?" The question sounded harmless, but the implication beneath it was unmistakable. Several conversations nearby suddenly grew quieter as people discreetly listened. Marin met Victor's gaze without becoming defensive. "Honestly, no," she answered with a gentle smile. "I usually spend Friday evenings cleaning flower stems and preparing wedding arrangements for Saturday mornings." Victor tilted his head. "That must be quite a change from this environment." "Every room has people," she replied calmly. "The flowers simply change." A few guests smiled at the unexpected answer. Victor continued, "Surely you understand that this foundation manages millions of dollars in charitable projects." "Ido. Then perhaps you can explain what qualifies you to stand beside one of the country's most respected business leaders." The ballroom fell almost completely silent. Alistair was about to intervene when Marin lightly touched his sleeve, asking him without words to let her answer. She looked back toward Victor with complete composure. "I am not qualified to replace my husband," she said. "That is not my purpose here. But I have spent years helping couples celebrate the most important days of their lives. Flowers taught me something valuable. The rarest bloom is never the most meaningful one. The flower people remember is the one that made them feel seen. Charitable work is not very different. Money builds buildings. Kindness builds trust. The two work best together." Several board members exchanged thoughtful glances. Victor remained silent for the first time since approaching them. Before he could respond, a young event coordinator rushed toward the stage looking visibly distressed. The guest speaker's centerpiece installation had partially collapsed after an equipment adjustment, leaving the presentation area looking unfinished only minutes before the foundation's largest donor was scheduled to arrive. Staff members hurried in every direction, uncertain how to repair the display quickly enough. Marin quietly set down her glass. "May I take a look?" The coordinator nodded desperately. Within moments, Marin was carefully rearranging the remaining flowers, adjusting greenery, repositioning candles, and transforming what looked like a disaster into an elegant arrangement that appeared intentionally designed. She borrowed decorative branches from nearby displays, balanced colors with remarkable precision, and finished the entire centerpiece in less than 15 minutes. When the donor entered the ballroom, the stage looked more beautiful than anyone remembered from the original design. Applause spread naturally among the staff before several guests joined in. Victor stood watching from a distance, his expression no longer skeptical but quietly impressed. Alistair looked toward Marin as she brushed a tiny speck of pollen from her hands and smiled with the same quiet satisfaction she probably felt after every wedding she had ever decorated. In that moment he realized she had not tried to impress anyone with wealth, status, or carefully chosen words. She had simply solved a problem by doing what she genuinely loved, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself feeling prouder than any successful business deal had made him feel in years. Over the next several weeks, Those small moments quietly became the happiest part of both their routines. The days following the gala passed more quietly than either of them expected. Headlines gradually shifted from questioning their unexpected marriage to praising the foundation event and the elegant floral display that had rescued the evening. Inside the estate, life settled into an unexpectedly comfortable rhythm. Maren continued visiting her flower studio each morning, refusing to abandon the employees who had helped her build the business from nothing. Alistair returned to his demanding schedule, often leaving before sunrise and returning long after sunset. Yet despite the distance created by work, small routines slowly formed between them. Every evening he asked how many weddings her team had completed. Every morning she left a fresh arrangement on the kitchen table, because she believed no home should begin a day without something alive inside it. Theodore watched these quiet habits with a knowing smile but wisely kept his observations to himself. One rainy Thursday evening, Maren noticed the light still glowing inside Alistair's home office well after 10 o'clock. She passed the doorway intending only to wish him good night, but paused when she saw him sitting motionless behind his desk. His laptop remained open, yet he was no longer reading the screen. One hand rested against his forehead while untouched dinner sat cooling on a tray nearby. She knocked softly on the doorframe. "You missed dinner." He looked up slowly, almost surprised to see another person in the room. "I lost track of time." She stepped inside carrying a mug of herbal tea she had prepared for herself. Without making a fuss, she placed it beside his paperwork. "You cannot solve tomorrow's problems if you forget to take care of yourself tonight." He smiled faintly. "You sound like Theodore. Then perhaps you should listen to both of us." For a moment neither spoke. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows while the grandfather clock echoed through the quiet hallway. Maren noticed framed photographs on a nearby bookshelf. One showed a younger Alistair standing beside a smiling woman in a kitchen, both covered in flour as if they had been baking together. She recognized the warmth in his expression immediately because it was entirely absent from the public image the world knew. "Your mother?" she asked softly. He followed her gaze and nodded. "She believed success meant leaving every room kinder than you found it." His voice carried a quiet sadness rather than open grief. "She passed away before Von Global became what it is today." Maren looked back at the photograph. "She would probably be proud that you still make her recipes." He lowered his eyes for a moment before quietly admitting, "Some nights I make them because it feels like she is still teaching me." Maren said nothing. Instead, she simply moved the untouched dinner tray closer to him and unfolded the napkin. "Eat while it is still warm." He obeyed without argument, and for reasons he could not explain, the food tasted better than it had on countless evenings spent alone. Later that night, as Maren prepared to return upstairs, Alistair suddenly felt dizzy while standing from his chair. He reached instinctively for the edge of the desk, steadying himself before he could lose his balance. Maren immediately turned back. "You are exhausted." "Just a long week," he answered. She stepped closer and gently touched the back of his hand. His skin felt unusually warm. "You have a fever." He attempted a reassuring smile. "It is probably nothing." That is exactly what people say before becoming much sicker. Before he could protest, she disappeared into the kitchen and returned a few minutes later with a thermometer, cool water, and medicine Theodore had already placed in the household cabinet. She arranged everything with calm efficiency, never treating him like a billionaire, only like a tired human being who needed someone to care enough to slow him down. As midnight approached, Alistair rested on the living room sofa beneath a light blanket while rain continued falling outside. Maren remained nearby reading a gardening magazine, quietly replacing the cool cloth on his forehead whenever it became warm. Half asleep, he opened his eyes just enough to see her sitting there instead of leaving for her room. Without fully realizing what he was doing, he reached out and gently held her hand for a brief moment, as though searching for reassurance in the middle of an unfamiliar dream. Maren looked down at their joined hands, surprised but unwilling to wake him. She allowed her fingers to remain where they were until his breathing grew slower and more peaceful, never noticing that Theodore had quietly passed through the hallway, smiling softly as he turned out the lights and left them surrounded only by the gentle sound of rain. By the following week, Alistair had fully recovered, but something inside the estate had quietly changed. Conversations that once revolved around schedules and logistics now drifted toward favorite childhood memories, recipes, and the small victories Maren celebrated at her flower studio. Neither of them acknowledged the growing comfort between them because both still remembered the agreement resting inside Alistair's desk drawer. It remained a silent reminder that everything surrounding them had begun as a carefully defined arrangement. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the piece they had built began to crack. Maren had just finished arranging fresh peonies in the foyer when her phone exploded with messages from friends, customers, and even strangers. Confused, she opened the first article. A popular entertainment website displayed a photograph taken outside the chapel on their wedding day, beside an image of what appeared to be several pages from a confidential legal agreement. The headline suggested their marriage had been nothing more than a calculated business arrangement. Within minutes, television commentators, online influencers, and financial reporters repeated the same story. Some accused Alistair of manipulating public opinion. Others insisted Maren had accepted money to play the role of a billionaire's wife. None of them knew the truth, yet every opinion sounded absolute. Maren's hands began to tremble as she scrolled through thousands of comments. Some defended her. Many did not. She quietly placed her phone on the kitchen counter just as Alistair entered, already speaking into another phone with members of his executive team. His expression remained controlled, but she recognized the tension in his voice immediately. "Find the source of the leak," he instructed firmly. "No speculation. Only facts." He ended the call and turned toward her. "I am sorry." Maren looked at him for several long seconds before asking the only question that mattered. "Did anyone besides us know about the agreement?" "My attorney, Theodore, and one member of my executive office who handled confidential documents." She nodded slowly, trying to absorb everything at once. "So someone chose to release it?" "Yes. And now the entire country believes I married you for money." Alistair stepped forward. "I will fix this." She smiled sadly, though there was no anger in her eyes. "Can you fix how people see me?" He opened his mouth but found no honest answer. Silence settled between them, heavier than any argument could have been. Later that afternoon, Maren drove alone to her flower studio, hoping the familiar surroundings would calm her thoughts. Instead, she found television crews waiting across the street and photographers pointing cameras toward every customer entering the shop. She quietly walked through the back entrance, greeted her employees with reassuring smiles, and spent hours trimming flowers simply to keep her hands busy. The scent of fresh eucalyptus and roses usually brought her peace, but today even those familiar fragrances could not quiet the questions inside her heart. Had she slowly begun believing in a future that was never supposed to exist? Had the warmth they shared over breakfast, the late night conversations, and the gentle touch of his hand been nothing more than temporary moments inside an agreement destined to end? As evening approached, she returned to the estate carrying a small velvet pouch. Theodore noticed her unusually quiet expression but respectfully asked no questions. She found Alistair standing alone in the library, still surrounded by legal documents and crisis reports. Without speaking, she placed the pouch onto the table between them. He looked down and immediately recognized the platinum wedding ring resting inside. His face lost all color. "Maren," she gently interrupted him. "When we signed the agreement, you told me that if this arrangement ended, I would return the ring." Her voice remained calm despite the emotion she struggled to contain. "I think we have reached the point where people will only be hurt if this continues." Alistair stared at the ring for what felt like an eternity. The same simple band that had once represented respect now suddenly felt unbearably heavy. He looked back at the woman who had quietly transformed his lonely house into a home, and realized that the greatest mistake of his life was not proposing an unexpected marriage. It was allowing the world to believe that the woman he had come to admire was nothing more than a contract. Alistair did not touch the velvet pouch for several long moments. Instead, he looked at the empty space where the ring had rested on Maren's hand only hours earlier. He finally lifted his eyes toward her, and for the first time since they had met, the calm confidence that defined him had completely disappeared. "Please do not leave yet," he said quietly. Maren shook her head with gentle sadness. "This was supposed to be simple. We agreed on respect, honesty, and 1 year. We never agreed to become tomorrow's headlines. She turned and walked toward the library door before he spoke again. I love you. The words echoed through the room with such honesty that even Alistair seemed surprised by hearing them aloud. Marin slowly stopped walking but did not turn around immediately. He stepped closer, leaving the velvet pouch untouched on the table. Somewhere between your flowers on the kitchen table, your terrible jokes about my work schedule, the nights you reminded me to eat dinner, and the morning you chose a simple ring instead of diamonds, I stopped seeing this marriage as an agreement. His voice remained steady despite the emotion behind every word. I began seeing it as the life I never knew I wanted. Marin finally faced him. Tears filled her eyes, but she remained silent. The contract may have been real, Alistair continued, but everything I feel for you is not written on those pages. That belongs entirely to me. Before she could answer, Theodore entered the library carrying a tablet with unusual urgency. Sir, every major news network is waiting for your statement. The board recommends saying nothing until legal counsel finishes the investigation. Alistair looked toward the screen, then calmly closed the tablet without reading it. Cancel every meeting I have today. Theodore blinked in surprise. Including the emergency board session? Especially that one. Within an hour, cameras from across the country gathered outside Vaughn Global headquarters. Investors expected damage control. Reporters expected carefully rehearsed legal language. The board expected silence. Instead, Alistair walked alone onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly into the cameras. There is one part of today's story that is true, he began. My marriage began with an agreement. That agreement was created to solve an unexpected crisis, and I accept full responsibility for that decision. Reporters immediately began shouting questions, but he calmly raised one hand. However, there is another truth that no leaked document can explain. The woman the public has judged over the past week never asked for wealth, influence, or attention. She asked only for honesty. She transformed my house into a home, reminded me that kindness matters more than reputation, and taught me that leadership without compassion is simply management. The room grew completely silent. Alistair reached into his jacket pocket and removed the same platinum ring Marin had returned only hours before. Holding it carefully in his hand, he looked directly into the nearest television camera. The contract described a temporary marriage. My heart does not. So today I am ending that agreement publicly, permanently, and completely. Earlier this morning, my attorneys formally terminated every legal provision of that agreement. What I am holding now is only a symbolic copy. Hundreds of journalists watched as he placed the folded contract onto the podium. Without drama or anger, he tore the pages neatly in half before setting them aside. From this moment forward, there is no contract. Only one man hoping the woman he loves will give him another chance. Across town, Marin stood inside her flower studio watching the live broadcast on a small television beside the register. Her employees remained completely silent. Customers stopped browsing and gathered near the screen. She watched every word, every expression, and every quiet pause that could not have been rehearsed. Less than an hour later, a familiar black sedan pulled gently to the curb outside the studio. Alistair stepped out carrying nothing except the small velvet pouch. He entered slowly, surrounded not by cameras but by the fragrance of fresh roses and peonies. Standing before Marin, he opened the pouch and held out the platinum ring once more. The first time I asked you to marry me, I was trying to save a difficult day. Today I am asking because I cannot imagine another day without you. Marin smiled through tears that she no longer tried to hide. She looked at the ring they had once agreed she would someday return, then gently closed his hand around it before placing her own hand over his. I am not giving it back again, she whispered. I think it belongs here. Over the following year, they slowly rebuilt their relationship without contracts, expectations, or public performances. Trust returned through ordinary mornings, quiet conversations, shared meals, and countless small promises kept. Then, exactly 1 year after the day that unexpectedly brought them together, beneath the same white rose arch where heartbreak had nearly defined her future, family and friends gathered once more inside the little Charleston chapel. This time there were no whispers of uncertainty, no hidden agreements, and no unexpected surprises. As Alistair carefully slipped the same platinum ring onto Marin's finger again, they smiled at one another with complete certainty. The flowers she had arranged seemed even more beautiful than before, not because they were more expensive, but because every bloom carried the memory that love is never measured by the way it begins. It is measured by the courage to choose each other after every reason to walk away has disappeared. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who believes in true love, and subscribe to Chosen by Love for more unforgettable billionaire romance stories filled with hope, second chances, and inspiring endings. Your support helps us create more heartfelt stories that remind us love is always worth believing in. See you in the next story.